Hey, deserving listeners, let me ask you a question. Are you a loner? Do you consider yourself to be a loner? Do you spend a lot of time by yourself? Do you like animals more than humans? Have you become a loner since the pandemic? Is it just easier that way? Do you find yourself avoiding invitations? Like when someone cancels a get together that you're invited to, do you feel upon learning about it's being canceled, do you feel relieved? Did you choose a career that didn't involve working closely with other people? Have you given up on dating and romance and sex, for example? Do you know any loners? Does this sound like anyone you know? Well, this episode is about the loner of all loners, and those loners are people suffering from schizoid personality disorder. People typically describe people with this personality disorder as being an extreme loner. That's like the easiest, most concise way of describing them. Someone who doesn't have any friends, someone who works at a job that doesn't require much interaction with others, someone who might play video games all the time, for example. But that is an oversimplification that I have learned while researching this deep dive. So let me tell you about a typical case that I'm just going to call Josh. So Josh is a fictionalized composite of clients that I have treated with schizoid in the past. So Josh is a man in his early 20s. He's living at home and he has no job, and he hasn't had a job for a while. The parents dragged him into therapy with me, and they get him to come into therapy by telling him that if he doesn't go to therapy, they're going to turn off the internet. So there's been a long fight, ongoing fight about his lack of moving out, his lack of not getting a job, his lack of doing chores, his lack of contributing or going to school or something. And they are saying, oh, we got to take him to therapy then, and he's refusing to go to that. So they started to threaten to turn off the internet. And they drag him into therapy with me. And the parents tell me in the beginning that he never leaves his room. He seems depressed. He refuses to get a job. He doesn't have any friends. He doesn't have any aspirations or goals. And since early childhood, he's always been detached from everyone, including the family. He's always in his own fantasy world, not just playing video games and watching YouTube and TikTok, but he imagines a lot of stories. He can spend hours and hours daydreaming. Sometimes when they have family get-togethers and they drag him along, he is either on his phone or he's just staring into the nothing, thinking about various different things. He plays video games all day and listens to loud music on his headphones. Whenever the parents trying to interact with him by going into his room, he is hostile or indifferent to them. They tell me that he's either very rejecting, like, get the F out of my room, stop invading my space, or he just seems to not care about them being around. The parents feel as though their son hates them for some unknown reason, or that he's depressed, or that he's always been depressed, or something, because he's always seemed detached. Unlike his siblings, the parents tell me, we've raised 4 kids, and the other kids are totally different. They have different sort of emotions. The parents also have been told by others that maybe Josh is autistic or that he has ADHD, and they're asking me for help and to assess Josh. So I start working with Josh, and the initial sessions are arduous for both of us because I keep asking questions, because that's often what happens in therapy, and Josh either doesn't answer or he answers very briefly. But after several sessions, I managed to gain the client's trust, mainly by just being interested in the things that he's interested in. He plays a particular video game, he watches a particular anime, and I just talk about that the whole time. Sometimes I would flip open my laptop and literally just watch YouTube videos about his anime with him. Even though I don't think much therapy is happening, at least I'm getting him to feel comfortable in therapy, which is often the case for young people. So over time, I'm able to get him to slowly tell me about some things. It's slow going for a while, but I am suspecting schizoid at this point, and I have an approach to working with this personality disorder. And over time, he reports that he has never understood how other people tick. He doesn't understand how people have the particular interests. He looks at people his own age, and they're just interested in things that he has no interest in. He doesn't even really understand their emotions. He's never understood other people's emotions very well. He doesn't understand their goals in life. They're constantly talking about drugs and alcohol and dating and other kinds of stuff, and he just doesn't understand that. They seem obsessed with sex and with relationships, and Josh, doesn't seem to be all that interested in that. And it all just seems completely incomprehensible to him. In fact, he tells me that he's never felt the need to have friends. He doesn't not have friends because he's not liked by other people. He just has never really wanted to have friends. He doesn't know the purpose of it, or a romantic relationship for that matter, or a sexual relationship. He just doesn't understand why people would want to involve themselves with that. He says that his parents think that he's avoiding relationships, but he says he's not avoiding. He just doesn't want to be around other people. He does admit that he misses a couple friends from high school from years ago, friends that he lost touch with years ago, but he doesn't miss them enough to reach out to them. And some of them have already told him that they're upset at him for not replying to their messages, so he figures that those bridges have been burned. He also reports that he does see a couple friends every now and then, and he enjoys catching up with them, but he knows that he's not really a very good friend like other people would be, because he doesn't initiate get-togethers, he doesn't really respond to invitations, and he doesn't want to talk about anything very deep with these people because they always want to talk about deep things or about sex or relationships or other kinds of nonsense, and he doesn't want to get into that. So he doesn't say to his friends that they're dumb. He just quietly backs away from those conversations and avoids a little bit. But he does catch up with them every now and then, and he says that he does enjoy talking to them. He reports that it feels laborious to hang out with friends who just want to talk because he has to act empathetic the whole time, which is really hard for him. He wonders if he is what the internet would call a sociopath because he doesn't seem to have empathy like other people. He wants to be a good friend, but it's just too much work, and it's kind of confusing, really. And he doesn't really want to let other people down. So he does have some empathy for people. He talks as if everyone is living a lie. He has a very superior attitude towards literally everyone on the planet. He thinks that everyone is lying to themselves. He thinks everyone is stupid, particularly for caring about dumb things like TikTok or fashion. He denigrates other people for their obsession with sex and marriage and sports and celebrities and fashion and being liked by other people. He thinks that he's risen to this other level of humanity where he's like an observer of humanity. He's like above it all, and in that it gives him a sense of superiority and some self-esteem. And during these sessions, I noticed that Josh, rarely has eye contact. He doesn't stare at the floor, but he kind of pontificates over my shoulder. He doesn't really look me in the eye, kind of like he doesn't really want to interact with me. He's more telling me things, reporting things to me as if he's talking to a camera or to the world. He's not really talking to me. And he doesn't say things in a way that invites a conversation. It's more me asking him questions and him pontificating for a while. And the client talks sometimes in a very short manner, almost monotone manner. He would answer questions, and over time I would cobble together a conceptualization, but most of the time he would answer briefly, particularly in the beginning, and also in this very monotone way that would want to put me to sleep. It had a very, if you have people on one end of the spectrum who are very charismatic and they engage people when they talk, lots of eye contact, lots of hand movements, lots of emotion and engagement with other people. That's on one end, and Josh was on the other end, where he was like a robot or something that you wouldn't be very interested in listening to. And not that he was boring, but you could see how people would think that he was boring. And sometimes I had a hard time tracking what he was saying to me. The things that he was telling me seemed to make sense to him, but I didn't know where he was. Sometimes he would leave details out, thinking that he had said them, but he hadn't said them until we discovered later. It was almost like he would talk in a way in his head, half in his head and half out loud, and he never bothered to make sure that he was saying all the things that were in his head. You know what I mean? And sometimes when I would ask him to clarify, I would wait for a while, because sometimes if I waited long enough, I'd sort of figure out by context what he was talking about. But other times it just felt like I had to know the landscape, and so I'd ask him a question, and some of the times he'd get frustrated with me because it seemed to annoy him that I wasn't keeping up with him, or that he had to bother to fill me in. I mean, he wasn't really angry, but he'd get frustrated with me. He says that he feels like he's not actually human, like he's an alien, or that he's in a simulation or something, like he's a program. And he also physically and mentally or spiritually feels detached from the world, like he's living in a dream or something, which was interesting to hear. And he had a hard time articulating this feeling to me, but it was very notable. So he would say that not only did he feel like he wasn't really a human, but he also felt like he wasn't really in the world itself. He felt like he was floating metaphorically through the world, as if he was like a ghost or something. And not like a hallucination, but it was the only words he could put to the way that he felt. He says that he doesn't understand why people freak out when other people die. Like when his grandma died, he saw everyone crying at the funeral. And Josh didn't understand why everyone was freaking out and crying and beside themselves, because his grandma was like 88 years old and was bound to die eventually. So why was everyone freaking out about it? It didn't make any sense to him. He knew that his parents predicted that grandma would die, so why were they so upset? And again, he would wonder if he was a sociopath, because he learned on the internet and from other people that he must be a sociopath because he doesn't seem to care when other people die. He told me that he didn't want to kill anyone. He wasn't like a sadist. He didn't have a desire to harm anybody, but he just felt like, I don't understand what's different about me, and am I more evolved? Is there something wrong with me? Am I a sociopath? And he wondered about that. He also says that he doesn't feel emotions much at all. More talk about being an alien or in a simulation or something. When I would ask him what that meant exactly, because for some people, they will frame emotions differently, meaning that I will see evidence of emotion, but they don't think of it as emotion. So I ask, what do you mean by that? And he would say, well, I don't really cry ever. I don't cry when other people cry. Like in sad movies or when my grandma died, I don't cry. I don't feel sadness. He would tell me that he doesn't laugh out loud during like a comedy or something. People would take him to a movie and they'd be laughing and he just wouldn't feel anything. And of course, I'm wondering about what the parents are saying in terms of him being depressed, because this looks like depression as well. And he says that everything just feels like a game to him, how to win the game of life by being smarter than other people, or having a better approach to life. He was very focused on that. And so I would also notice that when he tells a particularly intense story, like the time he almost died in a car accident a couple years prior, he doesn't express any emotion about the memory. He seems to not even have emotions about the memory, even having emotions at the time of the event. He just tells the raw facts of the story in this very matter-of-fact manner. But I wondered if he had emotions in the moment, but just didn't remember them, or had a hard time expressing them, or had a different way of expressing them, or something. I didn't really know. So as the sessions progress, Josh tells me that therapy seems to be helping a bit, which was very encouraging. He feels less depressed and a little bit more hopeful about the future, a little less stuck. He would admit to me eventually that he felt very stuck just being in his room and not having a job and not doing anything. And because he's a little bit lighter in the world and more interactive and less hostile, his parents have told him that they're happy, and they're happy the direction he's taking, and that they were backing off a little bit. They were ceasing their invasion of his room and getting him to stop playing video games and turning off the internet and stuff. So he did report to me that things were getting better. But he also says he doesn't really feel like he needs therapy because his life is fine and has always been fine, and there really isn't anything he wants to change about his life. But he is starting to wonder at the same time if maybe it'd be better for him to reach out to some of his old friends. He was starting to miss them. He's found himself thinking about them from time to time. And when he sees other people having fun with each other and dating each other, he wonders if he's missing out on something. But the urge isn't super strong, so he's not sure if it's worth the bother. Okay, so that's one case in which someone might come to my office and I might conceptualize them and label them as suffering from schizoid personality disorder. It's not the only presentation. I'm going to be sprinkling in a number of different case examples throughout this deep dive to give you an idea of the different presentations. The one I just told you about Josh is a typical one, but I would say maybe 50% or less of the clients that I've seen with schizoid present like this. So there's a lot of other sorts of presentations. But I hope you hear the themes, the lonerism, if you will, the fact that he didn't seem to want friends or want romantic relationships, how he felt superior to other people, how he didn't understand emotions in other people and himself, how he didn't really have any aspirations, how he communicated in a somewhat confusing way and also in a monotone or robotic way. Now, not everyone with schizoid has these characteristics. There's an underlying schema that all people with schizoid have, but it will manifest in various different ways, similar to any other personality disorder. Trying to just, when in the DSM, when they describe personality disorders or on the internet, they will list these symptoms, but that is a misunderstanding of what a personality disorder really is. A personality disorder derives from trauma that results in schemas and defenses that will manifest in a variety of ways. Two people with borderline personality disorder might be completely different from each other, even though at the foundation of their personality is a pervasive sense of protecting themselves from abandonment and rejection and betrayal. That's what's driving a lot of the things. So if you just look at symptoms, it might be hard to detect. A lot of the things that I presented right now could be interpreted as depression or autism or maybe even ADHD or just a normal young person who just isn't interested in relationships. So how do we differentiate? And in this deep dive, I'm going to go over that. So other things I'm going to do in this deep dive is I'm going to be going over research. I'm going to be talking about the causes. We're going to talk about the primary trauma for people with schizoid. I'm going to talk about the typical childhoods of people with schizoid, the typical parenting that people go through, and I hinted at some of that in the case example with Josh, but not very much. Of course, I'm going to go over the symptoms in detail. I'll talk about the DSM-5-TR definition and what I think about it. I'm going to talk about the differentials and the comorbidities. Like I said, it looks like a lot of other diagnoses. In fact, anecdotally, I don't know if I have ever met someone with schizoid who was properly assessed in the beginning by maybe even me, because it looks like so many other things, and the other things that it looks like are so much more commonly talked about. There's so much more awareness about autism spectrum than about schizoid personality. There's so much more awareness about depression or ADHD than there is for schizoid. There's also other kinds of things it can look like. It can look like narcissistic personality disorder. It can look like social anxiety or avoidant personality disorder. It can look like PTSD. So and it can look like psychopathy, sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder. A lot of people with schizoid will be assessed that way. And like in the example with Josh, he actually had diagnosed himself as being a psychopath, which is not the way that I would conceptualize a lot of people with schizoid. So I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the debate in our field about whether or not it's a disorder at all. There's a fair amount of debate about that. I'm going to talk about the types of schizoid, and I'm going to talk about the history of the construct going back to the 1800s within psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I always like talking about the history because it's interesting to me. I'm going to talk about the treatment, my treatment approach to schizoid personality disorder, and then I will also be reading some emails from y'all. So this is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. This full deep dive is just going to be for patrons of the podcast, but I will have a few free intros now and then, but which is where we're at now. We're in sort of the free public intro. Let me continue with that. So when you Google schizoid personality, in my estimation and my experience, there's a lot of bad information online. And I will include my own previous statements about schizoid, embarrassingly, were not on the mark. It's way more complicated than I thought it would be. And it's actually also way more in line with the way that I think. So I used to have a pretty simplistic view of schizoid. For those of you in the know, I have been working on a lot of deep dives. I've published a lot of deep dives over the years, and I've already done deep dives on a lot of other personality disorders. Why is it taking me so long to get to schizoid? Well, part of it is because a lot of people weren't asking for it because there's not a lot of awareness for it. Also, people suffering from this personality disorder, like Josh, don't typically think they have a problem because they're in denial of it. They lack insight, and also they're not very likely to reach out for help, even for information on the internet. That's not always true, but it can be. So there's a lot of reasons as to why, of all the personality disorders, this would be one that I would be doing later on in my career. The other thing was I was kind of avoiding it to some extent because I didn't think it would be very interesting to me because my conceptualization was so simplistic. And I am now telling y'all everything I've said about schizoid up until this date, which is late 2023, was wrong. I mean, not everything, but and I'll get into what I was wrong about. And I'll say I was wrong because it was what I'd been told and what I'd been taught and what a lot of people say online. But I was pleasantly surprised when I found out that the reality of schizoid, once I look at the research and the history and the construct and the various different consensi, there's a consensus, there's different consensuses within my field about what schizoid is and what the symptoms are and where it derives from. So I'll get into that later. And as a way of actually highlighting the bad information on the internet, I thought we would actually just look at TikTok, which is where most people, I'm not even joking, most people get their information, particularly young people, but really everybody, most people get their information these days from TikTok. So I thought I would just go to TikTok and just type in Schizoid into the search box and see what comes up. But first, let's take a break. Okay, let me tell you what just happened. I paused the recording and I went to TikTok. I typed in Schizoid. I actually did this a number of times to make sure that I was actually getting the top videos on Schizoid on TikTok instead of it being related to my algorithm on TikTok. And this is the top videos. And I actually watched a bunch of them and talked about what I was watching, but I forgot to hit record. So I did that all without recording it, but that's probably for the best because the first 4 videos that come up when you search Schizoid on TikTok were indecipherable. And basically, if I'm gleaning anything from it, they are equating Schizoid with being murderous of other people. So talk about misinformation there. So I thought I would actually search for Schizoid personality disorder, like the full phrase. Maybe that would go better for us. Okay, so the first video that comes up when you search for Schizoid personality disorder is by Dr. Tracy Marks. And I don't need to watch that video because I'm sure that's right on the money. Okay, here's one of the top videos on Schizoid personality disorder, and it is a 15-second video, very concise, which I appreciate, but it is just a still photo of what looks to be a teenage boy in a hoodie. It looks like he has 2 hoodies on, actually, overlapping. He has like a breathing mask or a ski mask over his mouth, and he's holding a pumpkin, and it just says Schizoid personality disorder over, it's just the caption over him. And that's it. Just this kid in a double hoodie with a pumpkin. He's looking off into the distance, and it says Schizoid personality disorder. Well, it looks like it's by a mom. Kelly is posting a video saying that maybe her son. Oh, I see. So in the title, the mom is saying he wears this outfit in 98-degree weather. I think saying that he covers himself up. Okay, is that indicative of Schizoid? Not really, actually. That's more indicative of avoidant personality disorder. But I don't know. I can't diagnose from afar through a TikTok, of course. But is this a trend on TikTok? Of course it's a trend on TikTok, where parents are just outing their children's issues and just using, again, I'm all for raising awareness, but my position on this. Even if you ask an 18-year-old person, but particularly, I guess, a minor, if it's okay to post these kinds of things, and they say yes, we all understand that they don't really understand what they're consenting to, right? It'd be like asking a 10-year-old if they would consent to, if I were to give them $100 right now, they will give me half of their paychecks for the rest of their life once they get a career. I imagine that some 10-year-olds would take that deal, but we understand it's not okay to exploit the inexperience of children when asking for consent, right? So to exploit your own children and just plaster them for 8 billion people, if the intention is to raise awareness, then I applaud it, but there's another way. All right, let's take a break. When we get back, I will wrap up this intro. As a way of talking further about the misinformation online, I thought I would talk about who the internet thinks has schizoid personality disorder. So when I Google famous cases of schizoid, this is a compilation of various different websites and blogs and stuff. And I think other clinicians claiming this as well. This is just a short list. I actually had a much longer list. And the long and the short of it, I think that people identify these people as having, these famous people as having schizoid because they are rumored or known to be a bit of a loner, and that's it. Just the fact that they seem to be a bit of a loner, as people would call them, therefore they have schizoid personality disorder, which is ridiculous. So the people on this list that I saw a lot were Cillian Murphy, the actor, Albert Einstein, Russell Brand, Edgar Allan Poe, Demi Lovato, the singer, actress. Ted Kaczynski is identified online as having schizoid personality disorder. And of the ones that people think, of the famous people that people on the internet think have schizoid, this one is actually possible because he did live in the woods by himself for a very, very long time, which would be hard for most people, purposely socially isolating himself. He also thought he was very superior to other people, which isn't always the case with schizoid, but it can be. Now, he was assessed apparently as having schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. So I have to take the word of the assessors for that. But he did refute the claim that he was psychotic. He claimed that it was some sort of political label that they were applying to him. I don't know. But, he does have some of the hallmarks. Because, it's one thing to go, oh, Russell Brand, the actor and political commentator, has schizoid because he's such a loner and he hates other people so much. That just is a pretty silly thing to say based on those claims. But Ted Kaczynski was alone for a very, very long time, and on purpose he was alone for a very long time, which would be hard for most people. Anyway, another person on the internet that a lot of people seem to think has schizoid is Vincent van Gogh. But, of course, Vincent van Gogh was diagnosed with everything. You look up any diagnosis and say, famous people with this diagnosis. I'm pretty sure Vincent van Gogh is always at the top of the list for every diagnosis in the DSM. But apparently, not only just silly people on the internet think he has schizoid, but people in my field have been speculating that Vincent van Gogh suffered from schizoid, and they've been speculating about this for like 70 years occasionally in my field. So this isn't just a bunch of lay people throwing around the label, but apparently the consensus is that from people who knew him, reports from people who knew him, was that he was definitely not a loner, even though the stereotype is that he was a loner. I think we have a romantic vision of artists as these loners who are ostracized and that kind of thing. And certainly Vincent van Gogh was suffering from a mental illness of some sort, right? But I don't know if we have enough information. Maybe we do. But at the very least, there's a lot of reports from people who knew Vincent van Gogh that he was not a loner, that he was very social, and he had lots of friends. So it's possible he had schizoid, because you can suffer from schizoid and have a lot of friends, paradoxically, which I'll get into later. Other people that have been identified as having schizoid, which I highly doubt, are Mike Tyson, the boxer, Charles Darwin, Isaac Newton. And so Isaac Newton, the mathematician, theorist, physicist fella, very important figure in physics. There are apparently some signs that he might have suffered from something like schizoid, or he might have been on the spectrum. Sigmund Freud, which is silly. Carl Jung, The Weeknd, the singer. Apparently he's a bit of a loner, I guess, but that doesn't mean he has schizoid. Mel Gibson, Adolf Hitler. Of course, that's another person like Vincent van Gogh that's always diagnosed with everything. But there is a chance, actually, that Adolf Hitler was on the schizoid spectrum because he was reportedly a loner. He was aloof, and throughout his life, he lacked close relationships. So it is possible, but there's a lot of roads to that. There's a lot of roads to being a loner and being aloof and lacking close relationships. It's not just schizoid. Other people have been identified: Stephen Hawking, Harrison Ford, Bill Gates, Keanu Reeves, Vladimir Putin, Sinead O'Connor, Kurt Cobain, Karl Marx. And then in fictional depictions, like movies and books and stuff, there's a lot of people that think the character in The English Patient, the movie, The English Patient, Ralph Fiennes' character, they will say that he suffered from schizoid, which I'd have to watch the movie to look into that. The internet seems to think that Belle from The Beauty and the Beast, that she suffered from schizoid, which is rather silly. I think because she's identified in the beginning of the story as being a bit of a loner in her town, and she likes reading, which is not an indication of schizoid necessarily. And another person in a fictional depiction, the movie Remains of the Day, that they believe Anthony Hopkins' character suffered from schizoid. And that one, from my memory, is possible. I think he was a bit of a loner and he was confused about the emotions of other people. So it is possible, but I'd have to rewatch that. And by the end of this deep dive, I hope that you will hear these claims and maybe even watch TikTok videos about schizoid and really have a chuckle because of how much more complicated schizoid is and how easy it can be misunderstood and how simplistic it is, the way that people talk about it and throw it around. Now, I want to talk about some legit famous cases of schizoid. So there's a few examples, people in history who might have actually had schizoid. Now, unlike other disorders, there's not a lot of people in popular culture we can point to, because if you suffer from schizoid personality disorder, you're probably less likely to seek the limelight. And you're also less likely to alert people to your issues. There's a lot of people who suffer, and I'll get into this too, there's a lot of people who suffer from what they call covert or secret schizoid, in that you would never detect that they had schizoid because they have very typical jobs and relationships and marriages and whatnot, but they are very much a loner on the inside. And these individuals are not very likely to ask for help or alert their issue to other people. So there's just not a lot of famous people we can point to. So I'm guessing there were a lot of people who suffer from schizoid, but we just wouldn't see any signs of it. But these are people who actually seem to have some signs. So the first one I want to talk about is Jack Kerouac, the famous American poet. In 1943, during World War II, he joined the U.S. Navy. He was honorably discharged on the grounds that he had schizoid personality disorder and therefore wouldn't perform well in the Navy. So he was evaluated by the medical examiner as having schizoid. Now, when I go into the history portion, it will become clear that the label back then in 1943 was used differently. Not super differently, but differently. So it's unclear exactly what the examiner would have been labeling him as. And also, for me, personality disorders are something that I assess over several weeks, if not months, because, if you just grab anyone off the street and ask them a series of questions, you're going to get a lot of people that will seemingly meet the criteria for schizoid personality disorder, but they don't actually have the underlying schemas and the pervasive personality problems of the disorder. There's a lot of people who might be alone for a variety of reasons, like they have social anxiety, or the pandemic scared them, or they just moved to town, so they don't have a lot of friends, and they're worried about that. They might even have a history of not having a lot of friends. Maybe they were bullied, or they have complex PTSD, or they have some other personality disorder. So just meeting the criteria, it's sort of like you grab the average kid, or really the average human of any age, and went through the list of ADHD symptoms. A lot of people would meet enough criteria to qualify for the disorder, but it takes a qualified examiner or assessor, someone in my field who understands these disorders well enough to take the time to really understand what's going on underneath the behavior and the pattern to discover if it actually is the personality disorder. And it's very important to know that, because when you understand the foundation of these behaviors, then you understand the treatment protocol. The second person that might have had schizoid is Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who killed John F. Kennedy in 1963, I believe, in Dallas. So during Lee Harvey Oswald's childhood, his father died of a heart attack 2 months before he was born. So he was born with a single parent, his mom, and his mom probably was under a lot of stress. And then the mom moved the family around a lot, apparently. So he attended several schools as a child. And as a child, he was described as being withdrawn and temperamental by several people who knew him. And when I get into the causes of schizoid, I'm going to talk about bullying to some extent. And kids who move around to different schools can often be bullied, or at the very least feel ostracized. So in early childhood, we have a kid who was moved around a lot, apparently had a pretty interesting relationship with his mom, and he was described by a lot of people, including staff at schools, as being withdrawn and temperamental. All right, but that could mean a lot of different things. In the 7th grade, he is in New York City at this point with his mom, and he often didn't show up for school, so he was evaluated by a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist diagnosed him with schizoid. So this would have been probably in the 40s. And as with Jack Kerouac, the label of schizoid was different back then, but similar. So I'm going to paraphrase in today's lingo or my lingo, the evaluation by the psychiatrist. So the psychiatrist described Lee as being an emotionally quite disturbed child. Emotionally disturbed and quite disturbed child. Okay, well, what does that mean exactly? And that he was disturbed due to his narcissistic mother. The psychiatrist identified his mom as being narcissistic. I'm guessing that he wasn't diagnosing from afar. He was just using it as a descriptor. And that in the evaluation, he said that Lee Harvey Oswald is isolated and deprived from others. So not only isolated, but also deprived. And I'll get into this more specifically when I talk about the causes of schizoid, because that detail right there could be the breeding ground for schizoid. The psychiatrist also said that he has very low self-esteem, and as a defense, Lee often engaged in a vivid fantasy life. Okay, so that can often be a hallmark of schizoid. And in this vivid fantasy life, he fantasized about power and omnipotence as a way of compensating for his lack of power in the world. So that psychiatrist was describing the way in which they viewed schizoid back then and the way we see it today. Other mental health workers worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, and they said that Lee, quote, he, the kid, felt that his mother never gave a damn for him. He always felt like a burden that she simply just had to tolerate, end of quote. So again, that's a breeding ground for schizoid that I'll get into later. So one of the breeding grounds. And apparently, Lee Harvey Oswald's problems persisted over the years, and professionals continued to worry about the parenting he was experiencing with his mother, which is really interesting that all the way back then, which I'm guessing would have been in the 40s, that he had a lot of mental health workers working with him, which I don't think was the norm. So I think there must have been a lot of alerts that something was up with this kid. And they tried to get these professionals, they tried to get the court to remove Lee Harvey Oswald from his mother because they were so concerned about the way the mother was. And according to Lee, he would say that his mother didn't care about him and that he was a burden to his mom. And I don't know if that ever worked or not. I doubt it did, but that's all I found on that reporting. Okay, so the third person I want to talk about that might have had schizoid personality disorder is Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not equating being a murderer and putting heads in fridges is somehow associated with schizoid. It's not. But apparently, from what I can tell, Jeffrey Dahmer was diagnosed formally with schizotypal personality, borderline personality, and some sort of psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. But it is also possible that he suffered from schizoid instead of schizotypal, but it's unclear. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. Okay, so let's take a break, and the rest of this episode will just be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to listen to this full deep dive, most of the meat on the bone, if you will, of this podcast deep dive will be during the patron zone areas. So if you want to hear the meat, then meet me in the patron zone by becoming a patron by going to patreon.com. But only if you want to. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.